The knock came at midnight, 3 sharp raps that cut through the storm like gunshots. And when Kieran Cole opened the door of his small ranch house outside Sweetwater, Texas, he found a woman collapsed against the frame, soaked to the bone and shivering so violently her teeth chattered like castanets. Rain lashed sideways across the porch, and lightning split the sky behind her, illuminating her face for just a moment young, terrified and streaked with mud. She looked up at him with wide eyes that held a desperate plea, and before he could speak, she whispered, "Please, I have nowhere else to go." Kieran did not hesitate. He pulled her inside, his strong hands gentle on her shoulders as he guided her away from the threshold. Water pooled on the wooden floor beneath her feet, and her dress clung to her frame in a way that made him quickly avert his eyes. The woman swayed, her legs threatening to give out, and he steadied her with one hand while reaching for the heavy coat hanging by the door with the other. "Here," he said, draping the warm sheepskin coat over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, hanging nearly to her knees. "You are safe now. My name is Kieran Cole, and this is my home. You can stay as long as you need." She pulled the coat tighter around herself, and he could see tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible over the storm that raged outside. "I am Stella Morrison." Kieran moved quickly, his years of living alone making him efficient in moments of crisis. He stoked the fire in the hearth until flames leaped and crackled, throwing golden light across the modest main room. Then he dragged a wooden chair close to the warmth and gestured for Stella to sit. She obeyed, sinking into the seat as though her bones had turned to water. "I will get you something dry to wear," he said, already heading toward the small bedroom at the back of the house. "And hot coffee. You need to warm up before we talk about anything else." Stella watched him disappear through the doorway, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. One moment she had been stumbling through the darkness, rain blinding her, horse gone, and hope fading with every step. The next, she stood in a warm house with a stranger who had shown her more kindness in 2 minutes than she had known in years. She pulled the coat closer, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to it, and allowed herself a moment to simply exist without fear. Kieran returned with one of his clean shirts and a pair of trousers that would be far too large but were better than the soaked garments she wore. He also carried a thick wool blanket. "There is a screen in the corner," he said, nodding toward a folding partition near the bedroom door. "You can change there. I will turn around and tend the fire." True to his word, he turned his back and crouched before the hearth, adding another log and adjusting the grate. Behind him, he heard the rustle of wet fabric and the soft movements of Stella changing. He kept his eyes fixed on the flames, giving her privacy, though his mind raced with questions. What had brought her out in such a storm? Why was she alone? And why had she come to his door specifically, or had it simply been chance? "I am decent," Stella said softly, and Kieran turned to find her swimming in his clothes, the shirt hanging off one shoulder and the trousers rolled up several times at the ankles. She had wrapped the blanket around herself like a shawl, and her long dark hair hung in wet ropes down her back. Even bedraggled and exhausted, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten. He poured coffee from the pot he kept warm on the stove, strong and black, and handed her a steaming cup. She wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the heat through the tin, and took a careful sip. The hot liquid burned all the way down, but it was exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she said again, meeting his eyes. They were kind eyes, she noticed, a warm brown that reminded her of honey in sunlight. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, lines etched around his eyes and mouth, but he could not have been more than 30. His dark hair was slightly long, curling at his collar, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. Kieran pulled another chair close to the fire and sat down, giving her space but close enough to hear her speak over the storm. "You do not have to tell me anything tonight," he said. "But when you are ready, I would like to know how I can help." Stella stared into her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. She had rehearsed what she might say if she ever made it to safety, but now that the moment had arrived, the words tangled in her throat. Finally, she looked up at him, and the kindness in his expression gave her courage. "I was supposed to marry a man named Harold Perkins 3 days ago," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "He owns land north of Sweetwater, a large ranch with cattle and horses. My father owed him money, a gambling debt that grew too large to repay, so they made an arrangement. I would marry Harold and the debt would be forgiven." Kieran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "I tried to go through with it," Stella said, and now the tears did fall, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. "I stood in my wedding dress in the church, and I told myself I could endure it for my family's sake. But when the preacher asked if I took Harold as my husband, I really looked at him, and I saw the rest of my life in his eyes. He is not a kind man, Kieran. He has had 2 wives before me, and both died under circumstances that people whisper about but never investigate. I saw how he looked at me, like I was property he had purchased, and I could not do it." She paused, taking another sip of coffee to steady herself. "I said no. Right there in the church, in front of everyone." The humiliation on Harold's face turned to rage so quickly. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and told me I had no choice, that a deal was a deal. My father just stood there saying nothing, so I ran. Kieran leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" Stella's voice broke. "My father will pay for my choice. Harold will demand his money and my father does not have it, and Harold will not let this insult stand. He will come looking for me." "Then we will deal with that when it happens," Kieran said firmly. "But you are not going back to him. No woman should be sold like livestock to settle a man's debts." The conviction in his voice surprised Stella. She had expected judgment, perhaps even anger that she had brought trouble to his doorstep. Instead, this stranger defended her right to choose her own path without hesitation. "I stole a horse from the church stable and just rode," she continued. "I had no plan, no destination. I just knew I had to get away. The storm caught me about 2 miles back. Lightning spooked the horse and she threw me. By the time I got to my feet, she was gone. I walked until I saw the light from your window." Kieran stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Rain still hammered against the glass and visibility was nearly zero. "No one will be traveling in this," he said. "You are safe for tonight at least. Tomorrow we will figure out what comes next." Stella felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. The adrenaline that had kept her moving through the storm was fading, leaving her hollow and shaky. Kieran noticed immediately. "You need rest," he said. "Take my bed, I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Stella protested, but even as she spoke, she swayed in her chair. "You can and you will," Kieran said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took her elbow gently and guided her toward the bedroom. The room was small and simple, with a bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a washstand. It smelled like him, that same combination of leather and wood smoke, and Stella found it oddly comforting. "Sleep as long as you need," Kieran said from the doorway. "I will be right outside if you need anything." Stella turned to him, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know me. I could be lying about everything." Kieran was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I suppose I believe that when someone shows up at your door in the middle of a storm asking for help, you help them. It is as simple as that." Besides, he added with a small smile, you do not look like someone who goes around lying to people. Despite everything, Stella found herself smiling back. Thank you, Kieran, for everything. He nodded and pulled the door partially closed, leaving it open just enough that she would not feel trapped. Stella listened to his footsteps retreat, then slowly unwrapped the blanket and climbed into the bed. The quilts were heavy and warm, and the pillow soft beneath her head. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled her under into a deep, dreamless sleep. Kieran sat by the fire, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared into the flames. He had been alone in this house for 5 years, ever since he had saved enough to buy the land and build a life for himself. He raised a small herd of cattle, broke and trained horses, and lived a quiet, solitary existence. It was not a bad life, but it was a lonely one. He had grown accustomed to the silence, to having only his own thoughts for company. Now, with Stella sleeping in his bed and the storm raging outside, everything felt different. The house felt fuller somehow, alive in a way it had not been before. He thought about her story, about the courage it must have taken to say no in that church, knowing the consequences. Most women in her position would have gone through with the marriage, trapped by duty and expectation. But Stella had chosen herself, her own safety and happiness, and that took a kind of strength that Kieran admired deeply. He also thought about Harold Perkins. Kieran knew the name, had heard stories about the man's wealth and influence. If even half the rumors were true, Harold would not take this rejection lightly. He would search for Stella, and when men like that searched, they usually found what they were looking for. Kieran would have to be careful, would have to think strategically about how to protect her. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he would keep watch and make sure she was safe. The storm finally broke just before dawn, the rain tapering off to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. Kieran dozed in his chair, waking every so often to check the fire and listen for any sounds from the bedroom. When the first light of morning crept through the windows, he stood and stretched, his back protesting from a night in the chair. He moved quietly to the kitchen area and began preparing breakfast, measuring out coffee grounds and slicing bacon from the slab he kept in the cold box. The smell of cooking food woke Stella. She opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings and felt a moment of panic before memory returned. She was safe. She was in Kieran Cole's house, and he had given her shelter without asking for anything in return. She sat up slowly, her body aching from yesterday's ordeal, and noticed her dress hanging over a chair near the door, still damp but no longer dripping. Kieran must have hung it up while she slept. She stood and smoothed down the oversized shirt she wore, then made her way to the main room. Kieran stood at the stove, his back to her, and she took a moment to really look at him in the morning light. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. His movements were economical and practiced as he worked, and she found herself appreciating the quiet competence he radiated. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and his face broke into a warm smile. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," Stella admitted. "Thank you again for the bed. I hope the chair was not too uncomfortable." "I have slept in worse places," Kieran said, which was true. "Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Stella took a seat at the small table, and within minutes, Kieran placed a plate in front of her loaded with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread fried in the bacon fat. Her stomach growled loudly, and she realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten. "Eat as much as you want," Kieran said, sitting down across from her with his own plate. "You need your strength." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Stella found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something steady about Kieran, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a long time. When they had both finished, she helped him clear the plates, and then they sat with fresh coffee and talked. "What will you do?" Kieran asked. "Do you have family elsewhere, somewhere you could go?" Stella shook her head. "My mother died when I was young. I have an aunt in Louisiana, but I have not seen her in years. I am not even sure she would remember me, let alone take me in, and I have no money for travel. What about your father?" "After yesterday, I do not think I can go back there," Stella said quietly. "He made his choice when he traded me to settle his debts. I love him, but I cannot trust him to protect me if Harold comes looking." Kieran nodded, understanding. "Then you will stay here." Stella's head snapped up. "I cannot impose on you like that." "It is not an imposition," Kieran said firmly. "I have the space, and I could use help around the ranch if you are willing to work. Nothing is free in this world, but I can offer you safety and a roof over your head in exchange for honest work. Does that sound fair?" Stella's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the desperate tears of last night. These were tears of gratitude and relief. "More than fair. I do not know how to repay this kindness." "Then do not try," Kieran said simply. "Just help me with the chores and we will call it even." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Kieran showed Stella around the ranch, which consisted of his house, a barn, a small stable, and several pastures where his cattle grazed. He had about 40 head of cattle and 6 horses in various stages of training. Stella proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker. She helped feed the animals, muck out stalls, mend fences, and prepare meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories of their lives. Kieran learned that Stella was 22 years old, 6 years younger than himself. She had grown up in Sweetwater, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had slowly gambled away his money and business over the years. Her mother had died of fever when Stella was 10, and she had essentially run the household from that age, caring for her father and trying to keep their lives together as everything fell apart around them. Stella learned that Kieran had come to Texas from Missouri 8 years ago, at the age of 20, looking for a fresh start. He had worked as a ranch hand for several years, saving every penny until he could afford to buy his own land. He had never married, though she suspected from the way he spoke that there had been someone once, someone who had broken his heart enough that he chose solitude over risking that pain again. As the days passed, Stella found herself watching Kieran more closely. She noticed the way he was always gentle with the animals, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice as he worked. She saw how he always made sure she ate enough at meals, quietly adding extra food to her plate when he thought she was not looking. She felt the way her heart lifted when she heard him coming back to the house after working in the far pastures, and how the evenings felt empty on the rare occasions when he had to ride into town for supplies and left her alone. Kieran was equally aware of his growing feelings for Stella. He loved the way she hummed while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. He admired her determination to pull her weight around the ranch, never complaining even when the work was hard or the day was hot. He found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to work on projects close to wherever she was, just so he could hear her voice or see her smile. At night, sleeping by the fire while she occupied his bed, he would lie awake thinking about her, about the curve of her cheek and the light in her eyes when she laughed. But neither spoke of these feelings. The situation was complicated enough without adding romance to the mix. Stella was still hiding from Harold Perkins, still worried that every sound might be someone coming to drag her back. And Kieran did not want to take advantage of her vulnerability. She had come to him seeking safety, and he would not betray that trust by pushing for something more before she was ready. 3 weeks after Stella's arrival, Kieran had to make a trip into Sweetwater for supplies. He could not put it off any longer. They needed flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that could not be produced on the ranch. He saddled his horse at dawn, and Stella walked out to see him off. "Are you sure you do not want me to come with you?" she asked, though they both knew it was too risky. Someone might recognize her, and word would get back to Harold. "I will be fine," Kieran assured her. "I should be back before sunset. Keep the rifle close just in case and do not open the door for anyone but me." Stella nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Be careful." "Always am," Kieran said, and then, acting on an impulse he did not fully understand, he reached out and squeezed her hand. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, electric and undeniable. Their eyes met, and for a moment Kieran thought about saying something, about telling her how he felt. But then he pulled back, climbed onto his horse, and rode away, leaving Stella standing in the yard with her hand still tingling from his touch. The ride into Sweetwater took about an hour. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with businesses and homes spreading out in all directions. Kieran hitched his horse outside the general store and went inside, nodding to the owner, Mr. Peterson, as he began gathering supplies. He was loading bags of flour onto the counter when he heard a voice behind him that made his blood run cold. "Well, if it is not Kieran Cole. I heard you had a ranch out past the creek." Kieran turned to find himself face to face with a man he recognized from descriptions Stella had given. Harold Perkins was in his mid-40s, with a thick build running to fat, thinning hair and cold blue eyes. He dressed well, his suit expensive and his boots polished to a shine. Everything about him spoke of money and the arrogance that came with it. "Harold," Kieran said evenly, giving a single nod of acknowledgement. "I am looking for someone," Harold said, moving closer. He smelled of cigar smoke and whiskey even at this early hour. "A young woman named Stella Morrison, dark hair, pretty thing. She ran off from our wedding 3 weeks back, and I am determined to find her. You have not seen anyone like that out your way, have you?" Kieran kept his expression neutral. "I have not seen anyone. I keep to myself mostly." Harold studied him, his eyes narrowing. "That is funny. Because I have been asking around, and someone mentioned seeing a light in your window during that big storm 3 weeks ago, late at night. Strange time to be up unless you had company." "I am a light sleeper," Kieran said. "Storms make me restless." "Is that so?" Harold stepped even closer, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper. "Let me be clear, Cole. Stella Morrison belongs to me. Her father owes me a debt, and she is payment for that debt. If I find out you are hiding her, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" Kieran met his gaze steadily. "I understand you perfectly. Now, if you will excuse me, I have supplies to purchase." He turned back to the counter, his heart pounding but his hands steady as he counted out coins for Mr. Peterson. He could feel Harold's eyes boring into his back, but he refused to show any reaction. Finally, he heard Harold's footsteps retreat, and the door of the general store banged shut. "That man is trouble," Mr. Peterson said quietly once they were alone. "He has been in here every few days, asking about that girl, getting meaner each time someone tells him they have not seen her." "I am sure she has her reasons for running," Kieran said carefully. "Oh, I am sure she does," Mr. Peterson agreed. "His last wife fell down the stairs, supposedly, broke her neck, and the one before that died from a rattlesnake bite in their bedroom. Funny how he always seems to be the last one to see his wives alive." Kieran finished loading his supplies and headed back to his horse, his mind racing. Harold was suspicious, which meant the situation was more dangerous than he had thought. He needed to get back to Stella, needed to make sure she was safe and figure out their next move. The ride home felt twice as long as the ride in. Kieran kept checking over his shoulder, half expecting to find Harold and a group of men following him. But the road remained empty, and by the time he reached his ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Stella must have been watching for him because she came running out of the house as soon as he appeared. The relief on her face was evident, and Kieran felt warmth spread through his chest at the sight of her. "I was starting to worry," she said, helping him unload the supplies from his saddlebags. "We need to talk," Kieran said, his voice serious. "Inside." Once they were in the house with the door closed, Kieran told her about his encounter with Harold. He watched the color drain from Stella's face as he described the conversation, and when he repeated Harold's threat, she sank into a chair. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I am here." "He suspects," Kieran corrected. "But suspicion is not the same as knowing. Still, we need to be careful. He is looking for any excuse to come out here." "Maybe I should leave," Stella said, though her voice broke on the words. "Find somewhere else to go so I do not bring trouble down on you." "No," Kieran said firmly, kneeling down in front of her chair so they were at eye level. "You are not going anywhere. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be." "But Harold does not scare me," Kieran interrupted, "and I will not let him take you against your will." "We will figure this out together, Stella. I promise." She looked into his eyes, seeing the determination there, and felt something shift inside her. This man, who had known her for only 3 weeks, was willing to stand against someone as powerful and dangerous as Harold Perkins to protect her. He asked for nothing in return except her company and her help around the ranch, and somewhere along the way, without her quite realizing when it happened, she had fallen in love with him. "Kieran," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "Why are you doing all this for me?" He covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his cheek. "I think you know why. Tell me anyway," she whispered. Kieran took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because from the moment you knocked on my door, soaking wet and scared, something in my life changed. Because every day I spend with you is better than the one before. Because when I am with you, this house feels like a home instead of just a place where I sleep. Because I am falling in love with you, Stella Morrison, and I cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you." Tears spilled down Stella's cheeks, but they were happy tears this time. "I love you too," she said. "I did not think I could feel this way again, not after everything. But you make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way no one else ever has." Kieran stood, pulling her up with him, and then his arms were around her and his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them mindful of everything unsaid between them. But then Stella's arms wrapped around his neck, and Kieran pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something passionate and promising and full of hope. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Kieran rested his forehead against hers, his hands on her waist, holding her close. "We will make this work," he said. "Whatever it takes." "Together," Stella agreed. That night Kieran did not sleep by the fire. Stella invited him into the bedroom, and they lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, talking quietly about the future they wanted to build. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal care. Afterward, Stella lay with her head on Kieran's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt more content than she had thought possible. But their peace was short-lived. 2 days later, Harold Perkins came to the ranch. Kieran was working in the barn when he heard horses approaching. He stepped outside to find Harold and 3 other men riding up the path toward the house. Stella was inside, and Kieran thanked God for small mercies. He had told her to stay out of sight whenever anyone approached, just in case. "Perkins," Kieran said, positioning himself between the riders and the house. "What brings you out here?" Harold dismounted, and his men did the same. They fanned out slightly, and Kieran recognized the tactic. They were surrounding him, cutting off escape routes. His hand drifted toward the revolver on his hip, but he did not draw it. "Not yet." "I think you know why I am here, Cole," Harold said, his voice pleasant but his eyes hard. "I want what belongs to me." "I do not have anything that belongs to you," Kieran said calmly. "Do not play games with me," Harold snapped. "I know she is here. Someone saw smoke from your chimney at odd hours, and you are buying more food than a man living alone would need. So let us stop pretending. Bring Stella out and we can settle this peacefully." "There is no woman here," Kieran said. "Just me and my ranch. Now I will ask you politely to leave my property." Harold's face darkened with rage. "Search the house," he ordered his men. Kieran drew his revolver in one smooth motion, cocking the hammer. "The first man who takes a step toward my house will regret it." The men froze, looking at Harold for guidance. Tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Harold's hand moved toward his own gun, and Kieran shifted his aim to point directly at Harold's chest. "I am faster than you," Kieran said quietly. "Trust me on that." Before the situation could escalate further, the door to the house opened, and Stella stepped out onto the porch. Kieran's heart sank, but he understood. She was trying to protect him, trying to prevent violence on her behalf. "Hello, Harold," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Kieran knew she must feel. Harold's face lit up with triumph. "There you are. Time to come home, Stella. We have a wedding to complete." "I am home," Stella said. "This is where I want to be with the man I love." "I am sorry about my father's debt, but I am not livestock to be traded. I will not marry you, Harold. Not now, not ever." "You do not have a choice," Harold snarled, starting toward the porch. Kieran stepped into his path, gun still drawn. "She does have a choice, and she has made it. Now leave." "You are making a big mistake, Cole," Harold said. "I have lawyers, and I have the law on my side. I have a contract with Stella's father, a contract that she is not a party to," Stella interrupted. "I spoke to Mr. Williams, the lawyer, when I was in town before the wedding. He told me that I could not be forced to marry against my will, not even to settle a debt. The contract is between you and my father, not me." Harold's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "Your father will pay, then." "I will take everything he has." "Then take it," Stella said, and Kieran heard the pain in her voice but also the resolve. "I am sorry it came to this, but I will not sacrifice my life and happiness for his mistakes. He made the debt. He will have to find another way to repay it." For a long moment, Harold stood frozen, rage and humiliation warring on his face. Then he turned to his men. "Let us go. But this is not over, Cole, not by a long shot." They mounted their horses and rode away, Harold casting one last venomous look over his shoulder. Kieran did not holster his gun until they were out of sight, and then he turned to Stella, who had come down from the porch to stand beside him. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish," he said, pulling her into his arms. "He would have hurt you," Stella said, her face pressed against his chest. "I could not let that happen." "And I could not let him take you," Kieran replied, "so I guess we are both stubborn." Despite the tension of the moment, Stella laughed. "I suppose we are." They went inside and Kieran barred the door, something he had never done before. They spent the rest of the day staying close to the house, both of them jumpy at every sound. But Harold did not return, and as the sun set, they began to relax. "You think he will really leave us alone now?" Stella asked as they prepared dinner together. "I do not know," Kieran admitted. "Men like Harold do not like losing, especially not publicly. But he knows he has no legal claim to you, and he knows I will defend you. That might be enough to make him back off. And if it is not?" Kieran set down the knife he had been using to chop vegetables and took both of her hands in his. "Then we will deal with it together, just like we have been doing. I meant what I said, Stella. I am not letting anyone take you away." She rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "I do not deserve you." "Yes, you do," Kieran said firmly. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, and I intend to give you as much of it as I can." The next few weeks were tense but peaceful. Harold did not return, though Kieran heard from Mr. Peterson during his next supply run that Harold had been making noise around town about legal action and justice. But noise was all it was. The lawyer had confirmed what Stella remembered. She could not be forced into marriage, and Harold's contract with her father did not give him any rights over her. Stella's father, meanwhile, had quietly left Sweetwater, presumably to escape his creditors. Stella felt a pang of sadness at this news, but also a sense of freedom. The ties to her old life were truly severed now. She could move forward without guilt, without looking over her shoulder. As summer turned to fall, life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Stella and Kieran worked side by side during the day and held each other at night. They talked about the future, making plans for expanding the herd, maybe adding some chickens, planting a larger garden. They talked about marriage too, though they were in no rush. They felt married already in all the ways that mattered, bound by choice and love rather than legal documents. One evening in late October, Kieran came in from the barn to find Stella sitting at the table with a strange expression on her face. He set down his hat and coat and moved to her side, concerned. "What is wrong?" he asked. Stella looked up at him and he saw tears in her eyes. But she was smiling too, a tremulous, joyful smile that made his heart race. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "Everything is perfect." "Kieran, I am with child." For a moment, Kieran could not process the words. Then understanding crashed over him like a wave, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the horses in the barn. He pulled Stella out of her chair and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you sure?" he asked when he finally set her down. "As sure as I can be," Stella said. "I have missed my courses for 2 months now, and this morning I was sick." "It is early yet, but yes, I am sure." Kieran cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "We are having a baby," he said wonderingly. "A family." "We should get married first," Stella said, her practical nature asserting itself even in her happiness. "Before I start showing and the whole town has something to gossip about." "Married," Kieran repeated, trying the word out. Then he dropped to one knee right there in their kitchen, still holding her hand. "Stella Morrison, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, not because anyone is forcing you, but because we choose each other?" "Yes," Stella said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Sweetwater. Mr. Peterson and his wife stood as witnesses, and the preacher, who had heard about Stella's first interrupted wedding, made sure to ask several times if both parties were entering the marriage of their own free will. When Kieran finally kissed his bride, Stella tasted salt from the happy tears streaming down both their faces. Harold Perkins did not attend, of course. He had left Sweetwater not long after his confrontation at the ranch, supposedly to pursue business opportunities elsewhere. But Stella suspected that the town's growing knowledge of his past wives' suspicious deaths had made staying uncomfortable. Either way, they were glad to be rid of him. Winter came, and Stella's belly grew round with their child. Kieran treated her like spun glass, constantly worrying that she was working too hard or not eating enough. Stella found his concern alternately endearing and exasperating, but she loved him all the more for it. She felt safe with him in a way she had never felt before, safe to be herself, to speak her mind, to make mistakes, and to grow. On a cold February morning, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling warm inside, Stella went into labor. Kieran rode like the devil to fetch Mrs. Peterson, who had delivered half the babies in Sweetwater, and then paced the main room while Stella labored in the bedroom, Mrs. Peterson attending her. The process took hours, long enough that Kieran wore a path in the floorboards. Every cry of pain from Stella tore at his heart, and he felt utterly useless, able to do nothing but wait. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the snow golden pink, he heard a different sound, the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Peterson emerged a few minutes later, beaming. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy baby boy, and your wife did beautifully. You can go in now." Kieran did not remember crossing the room. He was just suddenly there, beside the bed, looking down at Stella, who looked exhausted and radiant and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the tiniest person Kieran had ever seen, with a shock of dark hair and eyes squeezed shut against the unfamiliar world. "Our son," Stella said softly, looking up at Kieran with wonder in her eyes. Kieran sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out with one finger to touch the baby's tiny fist. Immediately, impossibly strong fingers wrapped around his own, and Kieran felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He is perfect," Kieran whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him James, after Kieran's father, and he was indeed perfect. He grew strong and healthy, laughing early and often, bringing even more life and joy to the little ranch house. Stella proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving but firm when necessary. Kieran was a devoted father, carrying James around on his shoulders while he did chores, telling him stories at night, teaching him about the animals and the land. As James grew from baby to toddler to little boy, the ranch grew too. Kieran's reputation as a skilled horse trainer spread, and people came from miles around to have him work with their animals. The cattle herd expanded, and they built a bigger barn and a proper chicken coop. Stella started a garden that became the envy of the county, selling vegetables and preserves at the market in Sweetwater. When James was 3, Stella became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Stella's mother. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas. The house that had once seemed spacious for 2 felt snug and happy with 5, full of noise and laughter and love. Kieran would sometimes stand in the doorway, watching Stella read to the children by the fire, or teaching Catherine to knead bread, or bandaging a scrape on Thomas's knee, and marvel at how his life had changed. 7 years ago he had been alone, convinced that solitude was his fate. Now he had a wife he loved more with each passing day, 3 beautiful children, and a life richer than he had ever imagined possible. And it had all started with a knock on his door at midnight, with a soaked and desperate young woman asking for help. He had given her his coat and his name, never dreaming that she would give him everything in return: love, family, purpose, and joy beyond measure. On their 7th wedding anniversary, after the children were asleep, Kieran and Stella sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out. The night was warm, late summer giving way to early fall, and the air smelled of grass and earth and growing things. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked, his arm around Stella's shoulders. "Knocking on my door that night, taking a chance on a stranger." Stella turned to look at him, her face soft in the starlight. "Never, not for a single moment. You saved my life that night, Kieran, and every day since you have made that life worth living." "You did the same for me," Kieran said, kissing her temple. "I was half alive before you came. Going through the motions but not really living. You woke me up, Stella. You made me whole. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, a distant owl calling, the soft nickering of horses in the barn. Inside, their children slept safely in their beds, dreaming whatever dreams children dreamed. I am happy, Stella said simply. Here with you, with our family, I am happier than I ever thought possible. So am I, Kieran agreed. So am I. Years continued to pass. The children grew. James became a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning as much as he loved working on the ranch. Catherine was bold and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the far pastures, keeping her parents on their toes. Thomas was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, with a special talent for gentling even the most skittish horses. When James turned 16, he announced that he wanted to become a lawyer, to help people the way Mr. Williams had helped his mother all those years ago. Kieran and Stella supported his dream, saving money for him to attend school back east. Catherine, at 14, declared she was going to run the ranch when she grew up, and no one doubted she would do it successfully. Thomas, at 12, was content to follow in his father's footsteps as a horse trainer. Stella's father never returned to Sweetwater. They heard eventually that he had died in Louisiana, the fever taking him just as it had taken Stella's mother years before. Stella mourned the father he could have been, but found she had no regrets about the choice she had made. Her family was here, with Kieran and their children, and that was all that mattered. Harold Perkins's fate was less mysterious. Word reached them that he had died in Kansas, kicked by a horse he had been mistreating. There was a certain poetic justice in it that neither Kieran nor Stella commented on, though they both thought it. On Stella's 40th birthday, Kieran surprised her with a new house. Not a replacement for the one where they had built their life together, but an addition. Rooms expanding out from the original structure to accommodate their growing family and the grandchildren they both hoped would someday fill it. The original main room and bedroom remained untouched, preserved exactly as they had been on that night when Stella had knocked on the door. "This is where it all started," Kieran said, standing with Stella in that original main room while construction continued around them. "I wanted to make sure we never forgot that. The night you came here, soaking wet and scared. The night I gave you my coat." Stella touched the coat, which still hung by the door after all these years. "And your name," she added softly. "And my name," Kieran agreed. "Though I would have given you much more if I had known what you would give me in return." "What did I give you?" Stella asked, even though she knew the answer. Kieran pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Everything," he said simply. "You gave me everything." They renewed their vows that day, in the newly expanded house, surrounded by their children and friends and half the town of Sweetwater. The preacher who had married them the first time had passed on, but the new preacher spoke movingly about the love that had built not just a marriage but a family, a home, and a legacy. As Stella stood beside Kieran, her hand in his, she thought about that terrified girl who had knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of a storm. She had been running from a life that would have destroyed her, but she had also been running towards something, though she had not known it at the time. She had been running toward love, toward safety, toward a home and a family and a life filled with more joy than she had dared to dream possible. "I love you," she whispered to Kieran as the preacher pronounced them still married, still committed, still choosing each other after all these years. "I love you too," Kieran whispered back. "Always have, always will." James left for law school the following spring. It was a bittersweet farewell, proud parents watching their eldest child ride away to pursue his dreams. But they knew he would come back. Sweetwater was in his blood, and the ranch would always be home. Catherine took over more and more of the ranch operations as Kieran began to slow down. He was in his 50s now. His hair shot through with silver, his movements a little stiffer in the mornings. But his mind was sharp, and he had years of knowledge to pass on to his daughter, who absorbed every lesson with fierce determination. Thomas, true to his gentle nature, started a horse rescue, taking in animals that had been abused or neglected and rehabilitating them. He had his father's gift with horses, maybe even surpassed it, and people came from all over Texas to see the work he did. When Stella turned 45, she discovered to her shock that she was pregnant again. The children were grown or nearly so, and she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But life, as always, surprised her. This pregnancy was harder than the others, her body older and less resilient. Kieran worried constantly, and even the children fussed over her, treating her like fragile crystal. But when their second daughter was born, small but healthy, with Kieran's brown eyes and Stella's dark hair, they named her Grace, because that is what she was. Pure grace, an unexpected gift in their later years. Grace grew up adored by her older siblings, doted on by her parents, and somehow managed not to be spoiled by all the attention. She had a quick mind and a quicker wit, keeping everyone on their toes with her observations and questions. James came home after finishing law school, bringing with him a wife he had met in Boston, a smart young woman named Clara who had grown up in a city, but fell in love with ranch life almost instantly. They built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, and James set up a law practice in Sweetwater, offering his services to people who had never been able to afford legal help before. Catherine married a rancher's son from a neighboring spread, and together they ran the ranch with skill and innovation, improving Kieran's methods and expanding their operations. Thomas married a widow with 2 young children, and he embraced fatherhood to those children as though they were his own blood. Kieran and Stella became grandparents, watching with joy as their children raised families of their own. The ranch that had once been a lonely bachelor's homestead became a sprawling family compound, with multiple houses and generations living in harmony, working together, supporting each other. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Kieran was 63 and Stella was 57. They celebrated with all their children and grandchildren, a huge feast prepared by many hands, with music and dancing and stories told late into the night. After everyone had gone to their respective homes, Kieran and Stella walked slowly back to the original house, the one where it had all begun. Grace, now 10 years old, was asleep in her room, watched over by Catherine's eldest daughter. They checked on her, then made their way to their own bedroom. Stella sat at the vanity, brushing her hair, now streaked with silver, while Kieran watched from the bed. He loved these quiet moments, the comfortable domesticity of long marriage. "You remember the first night I stayed here?" Stella asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Every detail," Kieran said. "You were so frightened, dripping all over my floor. I thought you were going to collapse before you made it inside." "I thought I might too," Stella admitted. "I had been walking for so long and I was so cold. And then you opened the door and I saw your face and something in me knew I was safe." "You were safe," Kieran said. "You always will be, as long as I am alive to protect you." Stella set down the brush and came to bed, sliding under the quilts beside him. They lay facing each other, hands clasped between them, the way they had lain together countless times over the years. "We built something good here," Stella said. "Something real and lasting." "We did," Kieran agreed. "And it all started because you were brave enough to knock on a stranger's door." "And because that stranger was kind enough to answer," Stella replied. They fell asleep that way, holding hands, surrounded by the life they had built together. More years passed. Kieran's health began to decline as he entered his 70s. His joints ached constantly and his breath came short after exertion. But his mind remained clear, and his love for Stella and their family never wavered. Stella cared for him as his strength faded, just as he had cared for her all those years ago when she had arrived on his doorstep with nothing. On a warm spring morning, surrounded by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, Kieran Cole passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 78 years old and had lived a full, rich life. At his funeral, person after person stood to speak about his kindness, his integrity, his skill with horses, and his deep love for his family. Stella grieved deeply but without regrets. They had had 50 wonderful years together, far more than most people were blessed with. She continued to live in the house they had shared, tending her garden, reading to her grandchildren, and holding the family together with her quiet strength. Grace, now 40, never married, choosing instead to stay close to her mother and help run the ranch alongside Catherine's children. She often said she had never found a man who measured up to her father, who had set the standard impossibly high for what a good man should be. Stella lived to be 87, still sharp and engaged until the very end. On her last day, she called all her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to her bedside. The room was full, 3 generations gathered to say goodbye. "I want you all to remember something," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Your father saved my life the night I came to this house. But what I want you to understand is that he continued to save it every single day we were together. Through his love, his kindness, his steadfast presence. And I hope I did the same for him. That is what love is. Choosing each day to save each other, to lift each other up, to be each other's safe harbor in the storms of life." She closed her eyes then, a small smile on her lips, and slipped away peacefully. They buried her next to Kieran, under a large oak tree on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land and the family they had built together. The ranch continued through the generations, always staying in the family. The original house was preserved as a sort of shrine, the place where Stella and Kieran's great love story had begun. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit it, would hear the story of the night a desperate woman had knocked on a bachelor's door in a storm, and how he had given her his coat and his name and, in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. Catherine's grandson eventually wrote the family history, documenting not just the facts but the love that had built their legacy. The book began with that midnight knock, with a soaking wet woman and a kind man, and it ended with a family spanning 5 generations, all of them owing their existence to the courage of one woman and the compassion of one man. The coat still hung by the door of the original house, preserved carefully through the years. On the wall beside it was a photograph taken on Stella and Kieran's 50th anniversary, both of them white-haired and wrinkled but with eyes that still held all the love and joy of that first year together. Below the photograph was a small brass plaque that read, "She knocked, he answered. And love built the rest." On the ranch, life continued its eternal cycle. Cattle grazed in the pastures where Kieran had once worked alone. Horses trained by Thomas's descendants carried riders across the same trails Stella had walked during those early years. Gardens flourished in the rich soil that Stella had first turned. And in the evening, families gathered around dinner tables in various houses across the property, passing down stories and values and love from one generation to the next. The original house stood at the center of it all, a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of courage, and the enduring strength of love freely given and gratefully received. It reminded everyone who saw it that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest acts of compassion, and that sometimes, when you open your door to help a stranger, you open your life to everything you have been missing. Stella's great-great-granddaughter stood on the porch of that house one evening, pregnant with her first child, running her hand along the weathered wood of the railing that Kieran had built with his own hands so many years ago. Her husband joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and together they watched the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Did I ever tell you the story of how this all began?" she asked him. "Only about 100 times," he said with a smile, "but tell me again." So she did, recounting the tale of a midnight knock, a desperate woman, and a kind man who gave her his coat and his name. She told him about the love that had bloomed between them, unexpected and undeniable. She told him about the family they had built, the legacy they had created, and the lessons they had taught about courage, compassion, and commitment. And as she spoke, the past and present seemed to blur together. The spirits of Stella and Kieran felt very close in that moment, as though they were standing right there on the porch, watching over their descendants with pride and love. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive, a living monument to the truth that love, once given freely and nurtured carefully, could grow beyond anything imaginable. The sun dipped below the horizon, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had shone down on Stella and Kieran all those years ago. And in the gentle evening breeze, if you listened carefully, you might almost hear whispered echoes of that long-ago conversation. A woman thanking a stranger for his kindness, and a man promising that she was safe, that she was home. Because some love stories do not end when the lovers pass away. Some love stories live on, generation after generation, in the lives they touched, the family they created, and the legacy they left behind. The story of Stella Morrison and Kieran Cole was one of those stories, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the most ordinary acts of human decency. And it all started with a knock on a door at midnight, a woman soaking wet and scared, and a man who chose kindness over caution, compassion over suspicion, and in doing so, found the love that would define his entire existence and create a family that would thrive for generations to come. The ranch stood strong under the starlight, filled with life and laughter and love, exactly as Stella and Kieran would have wanted. Their story had ended, but the legacy they had built together would continue forever, a reminder that love, true love, never really dies. It just changes form, living on in children and grandchildren, in stories told and retold, in lessons learned and passed down, in the very earth and buildings and air of a place that two people had transformed through the simple act of loving each other well. And every night, when the stars came out over Sweetwater, Texas, they shone down on that ranch with particular brightness, as though even the heavens recognized the special nature of what had been built there, what still thrived there, all because one desperate woman had knocked on one kind man's door, and he had answered.